I'm going to do that, and it'll be a little difficult. I'm not the best at cleaning up my hard drive on my computer, and when I was recording my lectures in the fall, it filled up like really quickly, so it's kind of annoying, but I'll start recording them, and I have a YouTube channel, and so what I'll do is I'll make a specific folder for Philosophy 205, and I'll upload um, the full videos there, and then I'll make some kind of a link available for you guys to access those YouTube videos in case you happen to miss a lecture sometime. And so also I'll remind you, if you'd like to now go to the Moodle page and do the attendance. So say that you're here. All right, and my phone has just been blowing up. Apparently the world is on fire. There's some crazy shit going down, not just at the Capitol, but elsewhere too. I'm sure you guys have heard all about this at this point. So I'm pretty distracted. I don't know how you guys are doing, but yeah, how are you guys doing? I mean, apparently I just heard a woman was shot at the Capitol building after people stormed it, and she was bleeding from the neck, and I don't know, there's just a new update every moment, it seems. But yeah, are you guys doing okay?
I'm on mute. I'm doing good.
Oh, good. You're doing all right. Does anybody want to talk about what's going on? Does anyone have any?
Thank you for that update. I did not know that. That's intense.
Yeah, I mean, it's happening like right now, and you know, Trump was fanning the flames this morning. I mean, essentially as he declared he would do. I mean, for weeks now.
I knew that people were like storming the building. I hadn't heard that there'd been a shooting. That's like, wow. That's
yeah, I don't. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, I heard just a few minutes ago, a colleague was watching the news and let me know. Yeah. Anybody else want to ask a question or have anything to add?
I learned from last year, anything, absolutely anything can happen. Unprecedented things are happening like crazy.
Oh, what was the last thing you said?
Unprecedented things are happening like crazy.
Yeah, I'm pretty sick of the word, actually, unprecedented.
Yeah.
At this point. Yeah, so it's the to respond to Grace in the chat, it's the protesters demanding the election is overturned, basically, putting pressure on Mike Pence, the vice president, because inaccurately the Trump has said that, you know, he can just make a decision and overturn the electoral votes in the key states. And last I heard as well, Pence had been evacuated by Secret Service because of the violence at the Capitol too. So yeah, I don't know. Michael Sacho, what was that you just put in the chat? Is that an image or something?
Yeah. It's a guy sitting in a chair in court.
Okay. I'm opening it. Let me see. Oh, and what is this image from?
Oh, I just saw it in the news. It's pretty powerful to me, I think. He broke in and just sat in like the highest ruling chair in the building.
Okay. So that's someone who broke in. All right.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, I just watched a few seconds of video from the inside of the building. Someone was filming them like smashing at the glass. It's crazy. But even though this is all happening, I guess we should try to have class as planned. And so, I mean, this is a relevant moral issue. It's obviously a political issue, but politics and morality are not essentially decoupled, right? There's an inextricable link between them, as we'll see today and as we go on as well in the weeks to follow. But just some other things, like I mentioned and we discussed Monday, if you have any further thoughts on some other hot button contemporary moral problems that you'd like to focus on for those debates in the latter half of the course, let me know, because at some point this evening I'm going to put together the poll for that so that we can start voting on our last ethical issue to discuss during week 10. So that will be the 5th ethical issue, to round out what we have already on schedule, to include first global economic justice, then end of life issues, physician assisted suicide, climate change, and racism. And so we talked about a number of candidates, a number of possibilities to fill in that final week. So if you have any other suggestions, you can let me know either today or shoot me an email, and I'll set up that poll so that we can start voting. And then once we decide on the last issue, I'll create an additional poll to create those groups so that you can start self-enrolling in the different groups. But again, that's not going to be important or relevant until after the midterm, so after week 5. So we've got some time before then. So are there any comments or questions or anything else before we dive into today's material? So today we're just going to talk about the basic components of ethics, the history of ethical discourse, its relationship to other constitutive domains of human life, such as religion, law, and so forth. And so I've prepared a PowerPoint lecture to jump into. But does anyone have any questions before I share the screen for them? Oh, God. Okay, so let me do that now. And again, even as I'm walking through this material, feel free to jump in at any time and interrupt me. You can unmute yourself, and I'll try to keep my eye on the chat as well for activity there. Okay, I can just find it. Just give me a second. All right, I'm going to share the screen. All right, so here we are in our first substantive day in ethics, Philosophy 205, moral problems. So this good fellow here is not actually Socrates, but I'm sure at least one of you knows where this image is from.
Is it Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure?
Yeah, so you might know him, at least from this image, better by the name Socrates, right? So this is Socrates. And as I think I mentioned before, when talking in broad terms about the history of philosophy, Socrates, and I'm sure all of you have heard the name, is a decisive figure in the history of this intellectual tradition. And that's why the period of Western thinking before Socrates is referred to as pre-Socratic philosophy. And what is it exactly about Socrates that justifies this kind of chronological and, in many cases, taxonomical distinction or distinctiveness? Well, this is a quotation from one of Plato's middle dialogues, the Gorgias, which, among other interesting things, is the first place in our literature, our Western intellectual tradition, where the problem and very idea of rhetoric, or the art of rhetoric, is presented and criticized rather sharply in the same place. And so when Socrates says this in the context of the dialogue Gorgias, that philosophical discussion is a matter in which even a person of slight intelligence must take the profoundest interest, namely, what course of life is best, he is saying that in contradistinction to the art of rhetoric or to oratory, which is aimed at persuasion, right? So rhetoric is aimed at convincing a multitude, so a large population of individuals of some position, whether or not it's true. So independently of the truth, which means that rhetoric in no way issues in or communicates or is aimed at knowledge. Instead, it's aimed at persuasion and conviction. And that's because knowledge is always knowledge of the truth. So if you know something that's false, well, then it's not really knowledge. You can have a false belief, you can have a false opinion, but the very idea of false knowledge is self-contradictory, right? And so what we're up to in ethics is basically following the dictum of Socratic philosophy from over 2,000 years ago at this point. How should we live our lives? What is the good life? What is the best life? What demands are placed upon me by others in my community? What demands are placed upon me by the very constitution of who I am as the person or individual that I am? What is this historical moment? And this is a profoundly relevant question at our current juncture in time. What does our historical moment demand of us ethically, that is in terms of our behavior? And so this is a turn or a transformation in the history of philosophy, because the pre-Socratic philosophers were more invested in what we call metaphysical questions, questions as to the basic constitution of the material universe, and such things as that, or cosmogony, how did the universe as such come about? And so etymologically, just looking at these two words that we'll be turning to repeatedly as we go on, ethics and morality, and they're often, especially in everyday popular discourse, understood to be interchangeable or synonymous, right? So ethical is taken as a synonym for moral in many instances. And I'm fine with that, although our textbook author, Louis Vaughan, adopts a particular position vis-a-vis the difference that holds between these terms, suggesting that, and many agree with him, many disagree. I'm more or less indifferent on this point, suggesting that ethics is specifically the philosophical study of morality. And so that's how he's going to be treating it in the chapters in this textbook. So ethics and morality differ in the sense that ethics is the philosophical study of morality or moral principles or moral truths. Just as metaphysics, as I mentioned a moment ago, is the philosophical study or investigation into the fundamental nature of reality, and epistemology, for its part, is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge. Okay, so what Socrates here is saying, or what Plato reports Socrates as having said, or at least having thought, is that, and this is true for philosophy as a as a whole discipline, really, given that Socrates takes these ethical questions to be fundamental to the practice of philosophy. Philosophy, and then especially ethics, is something that is of fundamental, ineliminable, that is unignorable interest for every human being insofar as they are a human being. It doesn't really matter what their background is. It doesn't matter what your own particular interests or desires are. It doesn't matter what religious context you were brought up within. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are, as this quote suggests, because we are all alive. We all exist, and we have to struggle with the indeterminacy, that is, the ambiguity of what demands there are imposed on us from without. And it's largely in response to these demands that we become who we are. And so, to use a quote from the 19th century existentialist philosopher Nietzsche, by philosophical discussion and ethical deliberation, over time you can become who you are. You can uncover the richness and the thickness of your own existence that often gets hidden or concealed or dispersed in a sort of confusing way through our familiar everyday actions. And so this is the etymology here. Ethics comes from the Greek ethos. So the word for ethics in Greek is actually ethikos. And so that's what's presented here under morality. But ethikos comes first from ethos. And this is something that we'll dig into very deeply when we talk about Aristotelian virtue ethics. So I guess in week 4, I'm thinking, without looking at the syllabus right now. But ethics comes from ethos, which means character, or it sometimes means habit. And there is a very important connection between character in the sense of one's personality, the substance of one's personhood in a moral regard, and habit or habituation. And we'll see that most pointedly when we discuss Aristotle's theory. But before that, more deeper in this etymology, ethos meant a place of dwelling or like an abode. And that's very interesting if you think about the Latin translation of habit, at least, from ethos. So habitus, and that's actually where we get the word habit in English. And think about the morphology of that word. So other forms of it as it shows up in our language. We talk about inhabiting a home, right? So your house is a place that you inhabit. So that's a connection that goes thousands of years back to the thinking of the ancient Greeks. And so, or think about like a habitat, which is where animals dwell. And in ecology, scientists study habitats to figure out exactly how the behaviors and the actions of different animals that inhabit this kind of environment or space actively in an ongoing way construct and change the terms of that habitat or of that dwelling place. And the same can be said about human social structures, right? So how we behave with respect to each other in our shared world constitutes, that is, gives shape and gives the impetus for changing things about the very world that we share. So the very ground that we stand on, ultimately. And so that's the sense in which ethics, although it is a particular area of intellectual investigation, it is extensively intertwined with everything, right? With everything we care about. And this is why Aristotle, in the book he published, thousands of years ago, after the text that we'll be engaging with in a few weeks, it's called The Politics. And in his book, The Politics, that's where we get, for example, economic theory even, ultimately. So the word economics comes from the Greek oikos nomos, which means literally rule of the home. So household management. How do we rule our home or beyond our own private dwelling places of our broader social and political community. But in that book, Aristotle argues that of all the sciences, ethics, or as he kind of makes this connection, political science is really the highest. It's the most important. And that's not because the subject matter of politics or ethics or political science is the most important. He didn't think that at all. Of course, theology studies God or the gods. And for Aristotle, that's a much higher endeavor in a certain sense. But what makes ethics and politics so important for Aristotle is that you can't conduct in a systematic, fruitful way an inquiry into theology or into biology or into astronomy or into physics or into anything unless you have, and again, this is relevant for our current situation with the social unrest, unless you have a more or less stable political structure in which people can flourish and in which people can share without fear of violent reprisal their most deeply held values and beliefs, and unless they can actually challenge the ideas of others, then not only can we not have a political, that is an ethically sound space to live our lives, but we really can't have anything else. We can't have science or art or religion or anything of that nature. So does that make sense? Any questions so far? Okay. And so this is Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish existentialist philosopher. And he's considered by many to be sort of the modern Socrates. He actually wrote his doctoral dissertation on irony in the Socratic figure. And he was very much concerned, among other things, with ethics. And so this is a very interesting quotation about the nature of ethics. He says, "But the ethical is not only a knowing, it is also a doing that is related to a knowing, and a doing of such a nature that the repetition of it can at times, and in more ways than one, become more difficult than the first doing." And so this is a difficult passage, and it's intentionally difficult. So Socrates, or excuse me, the modern Socrates here, Kierkegaard, wrote monumentally difficult prose, which was problematized further by the fact that he published his major philosophical works under different pseudonyms in order to kind of distance himself as the progenitor of these ideas from the various voices or characters that were expressing them. And that has to do with irony in the Socratic sense, this kind of distance from oneself. But what do you guys make of this statement about the nature of ethics? Does anyone have a way of interpreting it or making sense of it for us? Does anyone want to try?
I think it's about changing your perspective on, I guess, what you're debating over. It's about like creating like a habit out of your mindset towards, I mean, pretty much any like sort of like debate topic, you could lean one way, but if you come to feel a certain way about something and you realize that it's correct, it's about changing your idea so that it doesn't steer the wrong way like ever again. I think it's about like a permanent option, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about like building a habit or something because of
Yeah,
the
exactly.
yeah, because of the relationship between doing and knowing. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean that's right, and there's a connection to Aristotle here, but there's a subtle criticism really hidden in this passage, a subtle criticism of Aristotle that will make more sense once we start talking about Aristotle. But that has to do with the essential role of habituation and habit, according to Aristotle, for ethics. So according to Aristotle, as we'll see, and so this will be very quick just to get at what's salient here, but according to Aristotle, the highest moral character, so the paragon really of moral virtue is the individual who does the good, who does the right without difficulty, without any sort of anxious wrangling or self-doubt. And so it's not a struggle to do what's right. You don't have to fight your base instincts or inclinations. You simply do what's right. But that is, for Aristotle, the product of repeated doing over time. And so the more that you act correctly, that is, as we'll see, in accordance with virtue, as every instance of your life demands, the easier that becomes over time. But Kierkegaard is here suggesting that because human freedom is involved, even if you are habituated to do the quote unquote right thing, as different situations call on, you still have to, in every such interval where an ethical question or conundrum seizes you, you still have to make the choice. You still have to decide what's right and how you're going to act in the face of what you know to be right. So that's an important part of this, how the nature of this action is such that the repetition of it can at times, and in more ways than one, become more difficult than the first doing. And that means that unlike other affairs of human life, under other enterprises that we, so unlike other enterprises that we engage in as humans, it, in some important sense, never gets easier. And that's because there's always some new problem that it announces itself to you in your experience in sometimes dramatically different ways, which will require a new interpretation, which might actually belie the direction that your own background of past experience is pushing you towards. And so there's an insuperable difficulty here. But another aspect of this is ethics is a kind of science in the broadest sense of that term, that is, as the systematic pursuit of and uncovering of knowledge. It's a philosophy, and so it's intellectual. But Kierkegaard's further point here is, as a knowing, it's not only a knowing, it's also a doing. And that's where the difficulty comes in, because the repetition of that doing never results in a time in your life when you can imagine, oh, I've got it all figured out. I don't really have to think about things too deeply anymore. I have all the answers. That's simply not what ethics is capable of achieving for us, because that's not the kind of scientific, philosophical enterprise that it is. And that's because it is so deeply entrenched in our basic human constitution that goes back even farther than the earliest developments of our intellectual interests and scientific questions and so forth. And so Kierkegaard points out in other areas of his work that ethics is at the same time, and this is peculiar about ethics, at the same time, ethics is among the easiest things for us to do, but it's also one of the hardest. And the sense in which ethics is the easiest is just the fact that it's something that concerns all of us as humans. It doesn't really matter who we are, where we are, what kind of person we are, what sort of details make up our individual background. As long as we're human, we are going to be doing ethics at some point, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. So it's something intimately familiar to us. Yet, for the reasons we were just talking about, that doesn't make it any easier. When you're actually trying to get beyond thinking ethics and to do it, it's still the most difficult thing. And that's largely a result of the fact that even though it's something common to all human beings, insofar as we are human, there is no ultimate absolute arbiter, no final judge to whom we can appeal outside of our own lines of thinking to sort it all out for us. It's only us. We're the ones who have to do it. And it's not even just us as some sort of homogeneous monolithic whole. It's always us as specific individuals. So of course, we don't think or do ethics in a vacuum, in social isolation. We do it because we live and occupy and emerge from a shared world. But even still, no one can decide for you what is ethically right. You can talk to your closest familiars, your confidants, your loved ones, those in whom you have the profoundest trust. And you still have to decide, even if they've given you sound advice. It's still you who has to take that advice and do with it what you will. And so ethics, like death, is one of those things that we have to do on our own. No one can stand in for you. No one can represent you in doing ethics. You can't say, oh, well, I can't be held morally responsible for that because, my friend Jim told me that that's the right thing to do. And I thought he was pretty smart. Well, it's still you who listened to idiotic Jim's advice and acted on it, right? Okay, so does that make sense? Are there any comments or questions about this? So ethics is something not only that we must do, but that we're actively doing in many instances of our lives, whether we know it or not. But what does that mean more concretely? Well, doing ethics, and so it's a doing that's coupled with a knowing, but is not reducible to a knowing because it requires action. It means a number of things. So deliberating about the rightness or wrongness of actions, judging the goodness of your character or intention. So deliberating, that's a kind of action here. And what does it mean to deliberate? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
I would say like just act with intention.
Good, yeah, so there's the adjective deliberate, which connotes an intentional, on purpose or purposeful behavior, right? But etymologically, so going back to the origins of this word deliberate, it means to take a range of possible options or conclusions among which you are free to decide. That is to say, you are liberated, right? So if you have, say, 100 possible options in terms of how you can act in a certain situation, and there is no standard that would discriminate between the rightness or wrongness or the expediency or foolishness of these different options, then you are free, right? So when you deliberate, you kind of purposefully, through systematic thought, narrow in those options such that you're now no longer free to just do anything the hell you want. So that's what deliberate means in this sense. So deliberation, judgment, so judging the goodness of your character or intentions. Examining, or a different way to put that would be investigating or analyzing, right? The soundness of your moral outlook when it conflicts with that of others. So I seem to come to a different conclusion than you do when it comes to a particular moral question. Why is that? Let's let's examine our starting points. Let's examine our reasons and try to figure out where the disconnect shows up. Examining your own and other people's moral outlook, and questioning whether your moral decision or moral decision making rests on coherent supporting considerations, on the reasons that you muster to make sense of your decision or your actions. So by coherent here, I mean that the reasons that you give to explain or justify your actions hold together without contradiction. So that's what coherency means here in the logical sense. So ferreting out and recognizing where your moral beliefs might be in tension with each other. They might be contradictory. So that's another aspect of doing ethics. And so, as mentioned before, the author of our textbook takes ethics to be precisely the philosophical investigation of morality. And so what is morality, though? Morality can include all of this. So a moral system or a moral position or a moral framework contains beliefs concerning right and wrong. And these beliefs can include judgments, as I was just talking about, when we try to judge our own moral decision-making, values. And so we've already been engaged in ethics with the first discussion forum assignment for your personal introductions. And when we talked a little bit about this in class Monday, when I asked you to reflect on some values that you hold very deeply. So that's a part of doing ethics because you're examining morality. So values, rules, principles, and also theories. So we'll be talking about what these terms mean, how they relate to each other, and also how they differ. Morality helps guide our actions. It helps us to define our values and to put them into some sort of weighting order. That is to say, what values trump other values. And also, we can draw on morality in all of the senses we've talked about it so far to help give us reasons, or to at least clarify or illuminate the reasons that we already possess for being the kind of moral persons that we are. And so questioning, and 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger, to quote him, he says, to question is the piety of thought. And that just means really essentially that questioning is the very foundation of thought. You might even say it's the very basis, at the root of thinking. And so here are some essential questions that we find within the purview of ethics. What is the greatest good? Or even more simply than that, what is good? What does it mean for something to be good in the first place? How do we discriminate between good and bad? What goals should I pursue in life? And those two questions are obviously connected. So if you understand something, let's say, as one popular candidate, because these are questions that have been asked for thousands of years since the advent of philosophy in the Greek-speaking world. What goals should I pursue in life? Well, to figure that out, you might have to know what is the greatest good as this kind of standard by which to guide your thinking and your behaviors. Oh, yeah, sure, Diana. Sorry about that. But also, just to remind you, I'm making these slides available in a folder, so you should be able to access them after class. So you don't have to worry too much about taking down notes. But you might want to take down notes based on how I'm lecturing instead of what's on the slides, and that's fine. So I'll go a little bit slower. Okay. What virtues should I cultivate? And so that's a connection that we'll turn to when we talk about Aristotelian virtue theory in a few weeks. But does anyone have an idea? Does anyone have a suggestion of what the greatest good would be? If you thought about this, do you have an answer for that you think works for you, or do you think that it's true for you? So among all possible goods, what is the highest good? What is the greatest good? In Latin, this question was about the summum bonum, the highest good. Does anyone have an idea there?
If no one else does, I've thought about this before, and the conclusion that I reached was essentially to like better the world for all of humanity and whatnot, or like have offspring, have a kid that can then possibly do that, and kind of repeat.
Yeah, so that's good, using the word good. But I would ask, as a philosopher, when you say that the highest good is doing, performing actions or being in the world in such a way that you better humankind, right? But notice what is at play in that framing, better. So you might say the highest good is to do, good for all of humankind, but then you still might ask, okay, well, what is good though? So what would that actually look like? So a utilitarian philosopher might say, well, that means maximizing pleasure, which in a deeper sense means, because what the hell does that mean? I want to give everyone the most pleasure they can have. Well, I don't really think that's my fucking job. But what it really means then is to diminish badness. And badness from the utilitarian perspective is pain. So even if you can't give everyone the greatest pleasure in all of what they desire, you can at least work in the world to minimize suffering and pain. And so if you take pleasure, that is the absence of pain, or happiness is the absence of pain, to be the highest good, well, then that's how you could flesh out that answer. That's how you could say, well, I think the highest good is doing what you can to minimize suffering in the world. And then I think it would be a sound answer. But does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah. But then some philosophers might say, like Immanuel Kant, as we'll see, well, um, there is in an important sense an asymmetry, a disconnect between good in its connotations of pleasure and happiness and right, which he connects to law in the highest sense. And so sometimes by doing your duty, by acting in accordance with what the moral law demands of you, you might actually suffer. And that's for the best, Kant would say, because the moral law should outstrip or outweigh, at least, the pursuit of happiness, understood as the minimization even of suffering. So not everyone is in agreement on what the highest good is, but a response to that question seems pretty important. Right? Okay. Here are some other questions. And so I was just mentioning Kant. This is a question he would ask. What duties should I fulfill? What obligations do I have, and which obligations, given that I have many of them, which are more pressing? What value should I put on human life? Or what value should I put on all life if I want to extend, say, rights to non-human animals? How important is it to pursue the common good, kind of what Connor was just talking about, to do justice, to respect rights? If I can, it seems, minimize suffering or pain by maybe doing something that violates a person's right, is that okay? Because am I thinking that the maximization of happiness and pleasure outweighs the importance of respect for rights? Well, I don't know. That depends on how you think through these questions and these issues. And so this is something important to keep in mind. Even if you say, I'm going to be a moral nihilist, I'm not going to engage in ethical thought, whatever. I think ethics is all a bunch of bullshit. It's just whatever every individual wants to do. That's what's right. So I don't care about ethics. Well, you're actually doing ethics still, even as you say, I'm not going to do it, or I don't give a shit about it. That is, when properly expressed or teased out, that is its own kind of ethical position, right? And so that just speaks again to the fact that connects ultimately to the human condition, to what it means to be a human being, that you can't escape ethics. Even if you say, I'm escaping ethics, I'm not caring about it, you're going to be doing it anyway. And that's a kind of ethical statement. Okay. But what if you do adopt that ethical position of non-ethicality, or this kind of moral nihilistic position? Well, there are some risks. It might be a little bit easier, it seems, if you say, I'm not going to think about this stuff or commit any energy to sorting out these problems. But if you do that, you risk the loss of personal freedom, first of all. And why is that? So does anyone remember that discussion in the textbook where Vaughn was talking about that? So how is it that you might lose personal freedom by consciously avoiding ethics?
Might
Is it
get
when she
tossed
wouldn't be able to like defend herself or like defend her own thoughts or have her own sense of ethics?
Good, good. So thanks, Jackson. So yeah, you won't be able to defend yourself. And that was connected to a point made by Charles Taylor, the philosopher Charles Taylor. And he was very worried about, and this word wasn't used in the textbook, but misology. And that word comes from Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, in which he's talking about philosophical arguments and how it seems that, especially with young people, if engaging in philosophical arguments, you come to all sorts of different conclusions, which are radically at odds with each other, but seem equally justifiable depending upon your starting point, well, then you might be very suspicious of the value of arguing at all. And so you'll just leave it aside. And the same goes, according to Charles Taylor, for ethics. So let's say you fit very neatly, like a hand in a glove, in your moral community, let's say the community of your church or whatever. So you never really have any moral conundrums. You never face any difficult decisions. The moral authority of the church guides you perfectly well, and you're happy and successful and flourishing. But then one day you, for whatever reason, have to leave the confines of that safe moral community, and you're introduced or exposed to a challenge, to someone who says, I'm not from your moral community. I think all of that is complete bullshit. And I think you're totally wrong. Well, what are you going to do? You haven't been equipped with the faculties of moral reasoning. And so you won't be able to defend or justify or articulate reasons in support of the truths that you've been sort of steeped in and growing up in your moral community. And so if you're battered enough by these opposing views, you might think, well, I guess anything goes. I guess anyone's moral conclusions are right. And then you might be very suspicious of morality and set it aside, and now you're a moral nihilist. So you're someone who thinks that there's no such thing as moral right or wrong, because people can come to different conclusions. And then you're going to step outside of the demands of moral deliberation, and nevertheless, you can't escape it though. So that's a sense in which you still are pressured by the forces of moral problem and questioning. You still exist within that space, but you're not equipped to navigate it at all. You're not equipped to make sense of it at all. Okay, and so thanks, Jackson. I think someone else was going to say something too. Is that right? Does anyone else have a comment? Okay. Yeah, and also, if you just take what your parents have taught you, or what you learned early on in school, or what the media or popular culture or whatever else has sort of issued for you and your understanding of ethical rightness, well then your views as a moral being are never going to be your views. You're just simply going to be parroting what others have handed down to you. And you'll find yourself in a similar situation I just described. You won't be able to articulate, justify, or defend yourself. Okay. So all of these things we've really just talked about. So you'll have incomplete, confused, contradictory, or mistaken responses to questions that are interrogating your commitment to these particular conclusions of a moral nature. And this amounts to a kind of stunted intellectual and moral growth where you remain forever a child, dependent upon some sort of authority figure to tell you what's right. But that's a sham, because as I've just said earlier today, there is no such authority figure when it comes to ethics. So you might see such an authority figure in leaders of your faith community or your church, but they have reasons to support their reasoning. They're not just making shit up, right? And so it's not that the buck stopped there. They learned and adopted what they have identified and embraced as moral truths through ethical reasoning. So again, their authority is not really an authority. And so here's a quotation from the chapter. Of course, ethics does not give us a royal road to moral truth. That is, by doing ethics, again, you're not going to come to some final and determinate conclusions about the ethical landscape that will abrogate you or effectively wash your hands of ever having to do it again. Okay. And so, are there any questions so far? Comments? Okay, so again, feel free to jump in anytime. Here are the traditional divisions of ethics. So ethics is one kind of sub-branch of philosophy, and then there are sub-branches beneath the rubric of ethics. But ethics falls under more broadly value theory or axiology, which is a major division in philosophy alongside metaphysics, which I mentioned before as the study of reality, epistemology, the systematic investigation into knowledge. Logic is another major branch which focuses on and makes sense of correct reasoning or sense making, logical intelligibility. And so ethics falls under value theory alongside some say politics, social philosophy, and certainly aesthetics or philosophy of art. But then under ethics itself, we have these sub branches. So there's normative ethics, meta ethics, and applied ethics. So today and Monday of next week, we'll be talking about meta ethics quite a bit. And then when we get into moral theories, we'll talk about and work through normative ethics. And then the last 5 weeks or so of the course, when we turn to these hot button contemporary moral problems, we'll be doing applied ethics. Okay. I think there was something in the chat. So Diana said, so there's a type of morality where people judge morality based on circumstances and on situations. I cannot seem to remember what that was called. Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at, but there is a moral theory known as moral particularism. And that's not a moral theory that we'll be taking up in this course. It is a very modern, so a pretty recent moral theory, which actually undermines or attempts to undercut the principle of universalizability to some extent, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. But you might be referring to Vaughn's discussion of people who try to avoid the demands of ethics as focusing on impartiality and universalizability of rules and principles and so forth.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. It's just I remembered when we were talking about that, but I couldn't put a name to what I remembered. Yeah, that was this part that I was trying to talk about.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so that's a sense in which you are still engaged with morality because you're making choices, you're behaving in certain ways in reaction to certain conditions, but you might not really be doing ethics because well, as we'll see in just a moment, you're not really universalizing what seems to be the prescriptive rule that shows up in your situation, that is a rule that has to be applied to similar circumstances and so forth. But yeah, so okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's talk about these divisions of ethics. So we'll start with normative ethics. This is, I think, what most people understand. So non-philosophers, when they think of ethics, they're really thinking about normative ethics. So the study of normative ethics is the investigation into the principles, rules, or theories. And so we'll be spending a couple weeks on the dominant moral theories that guide actions. And the purpose of normative ethics is to try to establish the logical soundness of moral norms. Or beyond logic, the moral soundness of moral norms, the recommendability of certain moral norms. And so an example of a question that you'll encounter in normative ethics is one that we've already discussed today. Is happiness the greatest good in life? So the question of the summum bonum, of the highest good, that's a kind of normative question. Another one would be, should the rightness of actions be judged by their consequences? So if you say an action is right, what exactly do you mean by that? What makes it right? Is it right because it seems to have led to good or happy consequences for those affected? Well, then you're utilitarian. So that's utilitarian moral theory. But someone like Immanuel Kant will say, no, the rightness of actions should not be judged in accordance with their consequences. The consequences might be related to the morality of a decision, but they're also in important ways unrelated to the morality of a situation. Because however you decide to act and ultimately do act in a certain situation, you can't control every external material or social factor that will ultimately contribute or play a role in the consequences or the state of affairs, right? And so this is why Kant emphasizes the importance of motive or intention. So what did you intend to do with your action, completely independently of what actually happens because of it? Okay. So those are questions in normative ethics. Meta-ethics, which to some extent we're doing today and will continue Monday next week when we talk about subjectivism and relativism. Meta-ethics studies the logical structure of moral beliefs. And it investigates at a higher or deeper level, depending, I guess, on the spatial metaphor you prefer, what one takes for granted or assumes to be the case when doing normative ethics. So there's an important 20th century Kantian philosopher, Christine Kierkegaard, who refers to this as the fundamental meta-ethical question. And she also calls it the fundamental normative question, and that is, why be ethical? So you might figure out what is demanded of you as a moral choice, what is expected of you as an ethical concern, but then it's a different question as to why you should do it. So I might, for example, through moral deliberation, come to the conclusion that as a matter of ethical decision, I should be honest. I should avoid lying. So that means in order to be moral, I should not lie. But then I can still ask, well, why do I give a shit about being moral? What incentive do I have to actually be moral? Why do I care about that? And that's a question that we might pursue in meta-ethics, right? Or on what grounds can a moral principle be justified? And kind of connected to the question I was posing, is there such a thing even as moral truth? Is there really a difference between what we take to be moral right or moral wrong? And then lastly, so we'll be spending most of the time in the class on this third area, applied ethics. So here's where we apply specific moral principles or norms or theories or arguments to specific areas of our life. And so the purpose of this would be to study the results of what happens when you do apply such a principle or theory to a particular situation or problem. And we can learn something about our values when we do that. And we can also learn something about the particular area of action and practice that we're applying this thinking to. So business ethics, for example, when you're conducting questions as to what you're morally permitted to do, and that's a different question, of course, than what one is legally permitted to do, what you are morally permitted to do as a business owner, well, pursuing that kind of inquiry can tell you about your morality more broadly, what you hold true, what you hold as a deep value, but it can also tell you about the nature of the business in which you're involved, right? Questions such as, and this is a question that we'll ask in the second week after the midterm, is physician-assisted suicide morally permissible? And so that has to do with, in large part, medical ethics. That's a kind of medical ethical question. Is the consumption of animal flesh morally wrong? And so the question of animal rights, the question of how we ought to behave as consumers for our own nutritional livelihood, that's an area where we can apply some of these questions. So ethics is also about values and obligation, but so it's a couple minutes after 2:30, so I think maybe we should take just a few minutes of a break, and then we'll come back to this. Does that sound good? Some of you might need to use the restroom or get a drink or something. So let's meet back here in like 5 minutes or so, and we'll continue. All right, so I'll see you guys in just a few minutes. All right, I am back. Okay, we're all doing okay? All right, so let me jump back into the presentation. All right, so a couple of remarks about obligation and value. So this is something really, really important. And although I'll talk about it right now, it's something I'll have to repeatedly emphasize just because it's I think, a little alien and complex. But when we say, first of all, when we say obligation, we mean duty. So duty and obligation, for our purposes, operating in moral philosophy, they are interchangeable terms, right? They're synonymous. So what is obligatory is that to which you are duty bound. Now, obligation and duty are somewhat fancy terms, but what they really mean is what it says right here, what one should or ought to do. So if you think in a given situation that requires a certain moral response, that an individual should or ought to do something in particular, well then to say that they have an obligation or a duty to do that thing is to say exactly the same thing. So if you say, just to appeal quickly to Peter Singer, so we'll be reading his famous essay from the early 1970s on global economic justice for the first week after the midterm. But this very famous essay, he presents the thought experiment of a person walking past a shallow pond or a shallow pool in which a child is drowning. And the question is, do you have a duty as a passerby? You don't know who this child is. You didn't put them in the water. But do you have a duty to rescue this child, given that it's a shallow pond and you can easily just walk into it, so you're not under any threat at all yourself? You will, of course, get your clothes wet, possibly ruin your shoes. But do you have an obligation? Do you have a duty to rescue the drowning child? Now, if you say, if you hear this story, so if you hear about someone who walks by a kid that's drowning in a puddle and you hear that they didn't save them, if you say, well, what an asshole, they should have saved the kid. Well, then another way to put that would be they had a duty, they had a moral obligation to save the kid. But of course, that's a particular way of framing the problem, and not all philosophers are in agreement about it. So some disagree that constitutes. So simply saying that someone ought to or should do something might not be the same for certain philosophers as what is duty bound. And so that's what John Arthur, a critic of Peter Singer, whom we'll be reading, says. He says, well, I think you might be a really terrible person. You might be the worst person in the world, but that's not necessarily the same thing as failing to fulfill an obligation or a duty. So Arthur would say, if you're a lifeguard at a public pool and you don't save a drowning child, then yeah, you did fail in your duty or obligation. But if it's just some unknown kid, you have no obligation to save them. Now, maybe you should, but that's not necessarily the same. So this is a difficult theoretical or conceptual point, right? And then when it comes to value, though, obviously we mean value in many different senses. So there's economic value, there's artistic value or aesthetic value, there's value of convenience or expediency. But all these things are different from moral value. So there's value of a moral character, and then there's non-moral value. And then when it comes to even that difference, there are things which we understand to be extrinsically valuable. In other words, instrumentally valuable. And that means they're valuable as a means to something else. That is, they're valuable as a means to some end. Whereas if something is intrinsically valuable, it's valuable in itself. So that's what intrinsic means. It's valuable because of what it is, not because it's conducive to getting you or moving you towards anything beyond it, right? So what is an example? Can anyone come up with an example first of something that's instrumentally or extrinsically valuable?
I mean, maybe like something as simple as, I think one of the examples, like as simple as a pen, like
Mhm.
maybe like it helps you write down something valuable, but this is just a pen. The pen itself doesn't have that much moral value.
Yeah, or value beyond what it allows you to do, right? So, I mean, I guess I am, I have like at my desk here a drawer of some pens that don't do a goddamn thing, yet for some reason I keep them around and I pull them out and I'm like, fuck, it doesn't write anything. And I don't throw it away. I don't know why, because it's not valuable. I should throw it away. Because its only value is to allow me to externalize my thoughts on paper. Which means that if a pen doesn't allow you to do that, then it has no worth. Or food, for example. We value food, well, for a couple reasons. We value food for nutrition, in which case it's instrumentally value as a means to staying alive, right? But we also value it for pleasure. And pleasure is one of those things that could be understood as intrinsically valuable. So food is a means to the end of pleasure. That's why we prefer some foods more than others. But if you ask, well, what's the pleasure for? There's no answer. It's just, I like pleasure. I prefer food that doesn't taste like shit. Call me crazy. So let me see, there's something in the chat. Yeah, so Grace asked if happiness is intrinsically valuable. That's right, that's one of the candidates for that. And that's really important for Aristotle. And we'll talk about that when we get to virtue theory in Aristotle. For Aristotle, happiness, or in the Greek, eudaimonia, is the highest good, is the summum bonum, but that's not, as the utilitarians take it, to be synonymous with pleasure. So for Aristotle, there's a real difference between happiness and pleasure. And happiness in the Greek sense of eudaimonia doesn't mean the same thing as it does for us. So I think in many ways it's a bad translation, because happiness for Aristotle is not one emotional state that can be replaced with others. Like right now I'm happy, later today I'll be sad, and so forth. For Aristotle, happiness is an action. It's a way of being in the world which can accommodate, as appropriate, some different emotional states. So you could be characterized as happy in Aristotle's sense, but still at a different moment sad. If it's appropriate for you to be sad, you should be sad. Or if you're angry at something, you should be angry, and that doesn't mean you're not happy, right? Okay, so yeah, happiness is a great example of intrinsic value. Any other examples? Well, in the textbook, beauty is mentioned as another instance of what's intrinsically valuable. We like beautiful things, not because they're conducive to our getting anything else, just because it's a source of joy or something, to be in the presence of beauty. Yeah, the environment is intrinsically valuable. So that's another good thing. And we'll talk about that in, what is it? I think it's week 8. So we'll talk about some theories, some philosophers who do hold the environment or nature to be intrinsically valuable. But of course, not all philosophers agree with that. And we're facing, you know, the 6th great extinction event. We're facing ecological collapse through climate change. And so that's a huge, overwhelmingly important question. Okay, good. So some more some of the elements that make up ethics. So these are some principles, you might say. First of all, the preeminence of reason. Ethics involves critical reasoning. It requires critical reasoning. Reasoning which involves, in a robust sense, questioning your assumptions, your prejudices, your beliefs. And it's characterized here as the preeminence of reason because, of course, pathos, emotion, feeling is something that you can't really get rid of when it comes to ethics. And it's not something I would suggest as a philosopher that you would or should want to get rid of. So some philosophers hold that feeling or emotion stands in the way of truly ethical conclusions. I don't agree with that, but the point is that even if you do experience a particular emotional state or feeling in confronting a problem or a difficulty, that's really just an impetus or an invitation to reason through that emotion, right? To think more deeply about the emotion, to maybe bring to the surface the elements of that emotional state that are kind of dark or obscure, right? To gain some clarity about it. Because sometimes you might come to a particular conclusion of emotion or feeling just because certain beliefs or attitudes have been impressed upon you or inculcated in you for so many years and throughout so many experiences. And so you might have to sort of achieve a bit of critical distance from your feeling or your emotion to see if it's appropriate. But that doesn't, again, mean that emotion is the enemy or something to be overcome or eliminated. And so this is what I was talking about earlier as the universal perspective or universalizability when it comes to ethics. So logic demands that moral judgments follow this principle of universalizability. And what is that? Well, it's the idea that a moral statement that applies in one situation has to apply in all other situations that are similar in the relevant respects. And so if stealing is wrong, well then for any person that is stealing under comparable conditions, then it should be wrong for them too, regardless of who they are. And so this principle applies to everyone, especially, of course, in a democratic society, legally speaking. Police officers are still beholden to the law. So unless a police officer can justify why they're running a red light or speeding or beating someone in an alley, they have to be, morally speaking, if we take the law to have a moral basis, they have to be held accountable, right? And so the same goes, leaving the law aside, if you think that honesty is a really dominant moral principle that everyone should abide by, then you can't say, well, I lied in that situation, but do as I say, not as I do, as some parents occasionally will tell their children. Well, that is logically unjustifiable. And I don't want to talk too much about the logical place of this because we'll get into that in a couple weeks when we talk about Kant. Because for him, ethics is really tied up with a kind of logic, which he calls practical reason, as opposed to theoretical reason. And so we'll talk about that as we come to it. There's also the principle, and this is subtly different, but related, of course, to the previous principle of universalizability, but there's the principle of impartiality. And so the welfare of interests of each individual should be given the same weight as those of all others, unless there's a morally relevant difference between people. That is, the people who are given consideration in this particular context. So the universalizability principle says that to be a rule or a principle in the logical sense, it has to be universal. That is, it has to apply across the board to all relevant situations. So there we're really focusing on the situational aspect. But this principle, in contrast, focuses more on the subjective aspect of the moral agent, of the person doing the action, and those who would be affected by the actions. So an example given in the textbook of how this impartiality principle would apply is if you say, everyone deserves the right to fair legal representation except Native Americans. Well, then you would have to ask, well, what is it about Native Americans that's morally, or that's different in the relevant moral respect that allows you to exclude them? Well, skin color, ethnicity, background in a kind of tradition or way of life, none of those things seem to be morally relevant, right? And therefore, that kind of discrimination would fail on moral grounds. And then lastly, the element here is the dominance of moral norms. So when moral norms conflict with non-moral norms, moral considerations usually win. And there's something really subtly important about this point that Vaughan makes. And I think it's that although there are different values, there's a different sense of value in all these different places of applicability. So moral value is different from economic value, from aesthetic value, from expediency as a value, and so forth. But if we understand the norms that issue from moral values to achieve dominance over these possibly conflicting or competing norms, well, then the deeper upshot of that is that moral value, you might say, is the ultimate ground or foundation for all value whatsoever. So if you take a particular law on the books in a given country or state or municipality, for instance, to be really good, you really like this law, if you dig into it really deeply, you might find that it reduces ultimately to some foundational moral claim. That's why you think it's such a good law, because it coincides and supports some moral truth, right? And that's why, for example, when we challenge laws, such as in instances of civil disobedience, right? So think of like in the early 1960s when people were imprisoned in the mass protests for racial justice under the strength of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and so forth. Well, they were challenging immoral laws that were on the books, right? Just like those who preceded them in the 19th century were challenging the morality of American chattel slavery, right? So legal right is not identical to moral right. And for that reason, someone could say this law, which allows individuals to own other human individuals as property, is an immoral law, and we have to fight it. And fight it we did, and we changed it. And of course, there's still much work to be done in that area. But usually when a challenge is posed to an existing law or statute, it's on moral grounds that that's done. Okay, does that make sense? For any questions so far? All right. So now the last thing I want to talk about today is religion and morality. And hopefully you guys, in reading chapter 1, you read the selection from Plato's Euthyphro at the end. So how many of you were able to read that? Few of you? Okay. So I want to talk just a little bit about that. And we might have to continue the conversation next week, but we'll talk about that. So the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. So that's from Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, featuring, as usual, Socrates. So believers, so even if you are a member of a faith community, which gives you what might very well be a healthy and reasonable moral code, you still need to engage in moral reasoning. That is to say, in other words, you still need to perform ethics. You still need to practice ethics. This is because, of course, most religions provide, if not all religions, provide a kind of moral code or a moral framework in which to act as an individual. And some social scientists actually think that this is the ultimate origin of religion, to bring people together in an intelligible community with transparently shared values that can make sense of different behaviors and where those turn into transgressions or violations. But subscribing to a religious framework doesn't abrogate you, it doesn't let you off the hook, so to speak, from having to engage in ethical reasoning. And this is because sometimes those commandments or edicts or rules can either be very vague, they're too abstract, they're too generalized to be usefully applied to a concrete situation, or potentially they would conflict with each other. And when that happens, when a rule or principle from a religious origin is too vague or abstract to easily be applied to a situation, or when a given rule seems to conflict with another rule from the same orientation, that is the same religious background, well, then what do? Well, you have to engage in moral deliberation and come up with some kind of interpretation on the basis of ethical reasoning in order to make a choice, in order to land at a particular judgment or conclusion. And so consider this example from the textbook. Jesus commands us, as we all should know, to love our neighbor. That's great, right? But what exactly does that mean, to love your neighbor? Which neighbors are we supposed to love? Are we supposed to love those neighbors who disagree or even powerfully contest our inherited or embraced moral truths or commitments? Should we have to love our neighbors that would even do violence to us or that would rob us? Who do we love? So that's one question. Another question is, what does love exactly commit us to? So if I say I will adopt a loving posture towards my neighbor, concretely, practically speaking, what does that mean? Specifically, how should I act? So one example given in the textbook is, what if your neighbor is miserable or woefully depressed or in the grip of a painful terminal illness, and your neighbor asks you to help them die? Well, what does love mean then? Does love mean that you help them die, that you fulfill their request, or that you don't out of love? It's ambiguous. You could make legitimate arguments that support, it seems, either interpretation, but the point is you have to make an interpretation. It's not spelled out clearly for you. And that's why ethics matters, even if you're a religious person, right? Even if you do embrace the code that you've grown to love or to see as a guide for your own life and for human existence, you still have to do the work of ethics. And so I've talked about some of these examples, but the adherent of one religion might disagree with adherents of another, even within something like Christianity, for example. So if you're a Catholic, you might adopt different moral principles with respect to your religious orientation and upbringing than does a Quaker, right? Or a Protestant of some kind, a Lutheran, or a Seventh-day Adventist, or whatever else, right? Or Christianity more broadly might put you in a position to disagree with someone representing the Jewish faith or the Islamic faith, and so forth. Believers within a religious tradition might even disagree. So even two Catholics might end up disagreeing with each other on some important point. Believers will often find themselves in a position where they have to challenge or disagree with what their particular religious leaders are holding on a moral issue. Because again, that religious leader is having to make an interpretation of their own on the basis of what is supplied in the tradition and its writings and teachings, and having come in your own way to confront those writings and teachings. You might disagree with your leader's interpretation. Also, sincere devotees in a religious tradition might wonder at some points of a kind of religious crisis, a crisis of faith. You might wonder if its moral teachings make sense. And so if all you have to fall back on is the content of that tradition itself, if that tradition is sort of falling away from you in meaninglessness, then what do you have to find your footing again? Well, moral reasoning, moral deliberation, ethics in short, can help you there. It can help you find your faith again, or it can help you transition to a different faith or to leave faith behind altogether. And so intelligent resolution of conflicts among moral claims can be achieved only by applying a neutral standard. And moral philosophy, the practice of doing ethics, provides that neutral standard in the form of critical thinking, as we've talked about. And so what is critical thinking? Well, questioning your beliefs, your attitudes, your values, your presuppositions, making arguments in which you justify or rationalize. That is to say, you give reasons for. So reason just means the faculty by which we give reasons to make sense of, or to support, or to justify what we claim or hold to be true. And so here's a question, why couldn't progress in this regard be made by using your own religion, whatever that might be, as the standard for judging claims? So why can't we use a particular religion as this standard? Any thoughts on that?
Because my religion is the right religion. I mean, I'm not serious about that, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you have to recognize that not everyone subscribes to your religious framework. And so if you say, well, here's what my religious tradition says is right, someone could easily respond, well, that's not my religious tradition, so that's not a reason that's going to persuade me. So that means we need to use moral reasoning as a neutral sort of arbiter for persuasion, for those who don't yet understand what is morally expected of them given a particular situation, and maybe don't even subscribe to any religious tradition at all in the first place. And so that's what's so powerful about ethical philosophy, is that you can be a theist, you can be religiously minded, or you can be entirely atheistic. And often those attitudes will find parallels or resonances with each other. So for example, a Christian will, in many instances, come to the very same moral conclusion that an atheist does. And so the difference in religious background doesn't amount necessarily to a difference in moral judgment or belief. So Immanuel Kant, for example, was a deeply pious Christian religious thinker, as we'll see, but he did not ground his moral theory in anything religious, right? Because reason, rationality, is not Christian, and Kant thought that one comes to moral truth through the deployment of our native human reason, which is shared by everyone. He thought even potentially intelligent extraterrestrials. So Kant thought, interestingly, it was a matter of probabilistic truth that there is surely intelligent life other than human beings out there in the universe. And he says, where there is such intelligent life, where there is rationality, these alien beings would ultimately have to come to the same moral conclusions that we do, right? So again, the universality of reason. Okay. Even if you are religious or discoursing with religious people, ethics enables productive discourse. So only with a common set of ethical concepts and agreed upon procedures for deciding how to make judgments, and how to do this with people that represent completely different, in many cases, religious traditions. This is important to be able to talk fruitfully, that is, productively, to make progress with each other in our shared values and concerns. So here are a few basic rules of fruitful moral discourse that we should strive to keep in mind as we work through these moral theories once we turn to them and these real world concrete issues. So moral positions should be explained. So if you adopt a particular position, morally speaking, with respect to some question or problem, that position ought to be explicable. And when I say it ought to be explicable, I'm using the language of obligation. So you have a kind of duty to be able to render transparent why you have done what you have done, why you have made the decision that you have. Secondly, your moral claims, when you say, for example, X action is right, X action is wrong, this is something one should do, and so forth, they should be supported by reasons. So that's what it means, again, to engage in reasoning. And then lastly, reasoning should be judged by common rational standards. And that's exactly what ethics provides. Unlike arguing between proponents of different religious traditions or backgrounds, who are going to, of course, leverage the strength of the material coming from their own tradition to achieve persuasion. Well, that's not going to work against those who already disagree with the very religious truths or principles that you are communicating. And so we need some kind of common rational standard that would hold for everyone. That is, every moral agent, every rational creature, human or otherwise, we might say. Okay. All right, so to round out, to finish up our discussion of the relationship between morality and religion, let's talk about divine command theory. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this as a meta-ethical position next week on Monday, when we talk about subjectivism, emotivism, and relativism, especially as meta-ethical starting points. So divine command theory is one of those meta-ethical starting points. And it's a meta-ethical starting point because it basically says what is good in the moral sense. So what is morally good and what is morally right is determined by God's will. That is expressed by and founded in God's command. So moral good, moral right just means precisely what God commanded, what God decrees of us, and there's no difference. So many theistically minded or religious people actually today still hold this view, right? So they say what is right because God said it's right. That is, we can appeal to, say, the 10 Commandments to figure out what's right and wrong. If God says don't do this in the 10 Commandments, well, that's all we need to know why it's bad. So divine command theory basically says that there is a difference between right and wrong, good and bad, and God is the being who is ultimately responsible for that difference. And if that's true, well, there are a number of implications or consequences, one of which would be that if you are an atheist, for example, well, then you are by definition immoral. So if you don't subscribe to this religious view, that is that God's commandments are the source of rightness, then anything you do will necessarily be somehow outside of that. So necessarily beyond goodness or rightness in the moral sense. And divine command theory, as I've explained it, is interesting in that both religious and non-religious people have accepted it. And so non-religious in the sense of certain existentialist philosophers or nihilists who want to come to the conclusion that there is no moral right and wrong. So for example, in Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov, and this was mentioned in chapter 1 of our reading, of our textbook, the character Ivan, who represents this kind of hyper-rationalist person, declares, if there is no God, or in the absence of God, everything is permitted. So if there is no God to underwrite the difference, to support the difference between good and bad, right and wrong, well, then there is no such difference, and everything is okay. Everything is permitted. And so the Euthyphro dilemma is the earliest point in our Western intellectual tradition where, and this is prior to the advent of certain forms of monotheism, right? So we're talking about a Greek polytheistic worldview here, where divine command theory gets challenged. And it's, even though coming from a Greek provenance or origin, it's very much applicable to this kind of Christian theistic situation. And so in the Euthyphro, for those of you who did the reading, and this is a dialogue where Socrates encounters this figure whom some recognize as a kind of prophet or something. His name is Euthyphro, so that's why the dialogue has the name. And Socrates and Euthyphro encounter one another on their way to the courthouse. Socrates, because he's going to face the charges that have been leveled against him, and of which he's ultimately convicted and sentenced to death. So he's about to go hear what these charges are, this indictment, and Euthyphro is about to go make his own indictment. He's about to go charge his own father for murder. And Socrates says, wow, most Athenians, most Greeks would say that is a horribly disrespectful thing to do to your parent, right? To take your father into a court of law and charge him with murder. So in other words, Socrates says, that is a deeply impious thing to do, it seems. Yet you're very confident that what you're doing is right. Therefore, you must know a lot about piety. And he says, so please teach me. And he's being ironic, of course. He says, basically, please teach me what is piety. What, in other words, what do the gods demand? What is holy, so that I can go into court and tell them, look, I learned everything I know about holiness and piety from my man Euthyphro, and he's an expert. So if you have a problem with what I've done, maybe you should take it up with him. And Euthyphro doesn't really get Socrates' irony, and he's like, yeah, that's right. You can do that because I am an expert. But then it turns out, of course, that Euthyphro doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. And he ends up contradicting himself repeatedly. But the most important, the most enduring problem that emerges from this dialogue is the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. So at a certain point in their conversation, Euthyphro gives the answer that what is piety or what is holy is what all the gods in common love, what they all think is right, what they all embrace as good. And so Socrates asks this question, well, what is pious because God says it is? Or does God say it's pious because it's pious? And we can apply that kind of question to moral rightness or goodness. And this is a question posed to the divine command theorist. So if it's true that God is responsible for the difference between right and wrong, then is what is right right because God says it is, or does God say it is because it's right? And why is this a dilemma? So what's the problem here? Anyone?
I really liked this this part of the reading, because then he goes on to talk about like you know, say an object is being carried, is that object carried, yeah, is it carried because I can't remember exactly how it's put, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was like a really unique and intriguing perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of confusing the wording there, but imagine you're holding a box, right? You're carrying a box. Now, the box is being carried, right? So that's how you would describe it in a sentence. You would say that box is being carried. But is the person carrying the box because the box is being carried? Well, no. You say the box is being carried because someone is carrying the box, right? So for this reason, Socrates ends up committing Euthyphro to the conclusion that it has to be, in terms of these alternatives, what is right has to be right, and God has to say it's right because it's right. Otherwise, you would have the same absurdity. But that's not exactly what contemporary philosophers do completely with this dilemma. Let me check the time. We're almost out of time, but we only have a couple more slides to work through. But here is something that contemporary philosophers do in terms of criticizing divine command theory. So if it's true that God is responsible for the difference between right and wrong, well, how is that difference determined? So let's imagine that there's some point before the creation of the world where God is deciding what's going to be right and what's going to be wrong. Well, how does he make that decision? Well, how do we make decisions ourselves? There are only a couple of ways. We can do so for a good reason. So if I do something and someone asks me, why did you do that? I'll say, oh, I did it because of da 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 da. Or we can do something spontaneously, totally arbitrarily, no reason at all. So imagine you have an aunt or something that's going to come over for dinner and you want to figure out what to make her. So if you do it arbitrarily for no reason at all, let's say you open up the cookbook, you just randomly come to a page and you say, it looks like she's getting ambrosia salad. I have no fucking idea what that is, but I guess I have to make it. And if someone asks you, why are you in the kitchen making ambrosia salad? You'll say, I don't fucking know. I have to make Aunt Susan dinner, and that's what I found in the cookbook. It's totally arbitrary, no reason. But let's say you know Aunt Susan's favorite dinner is lasagna. So you're baking a lasagna. Someone asks you why. You say, oh, because that's what Aunt Susan likes. That's why I'm making lasagna and not ambrosia salad, right? But if it's true that God decides the difference between right and wrong arbitrarily, that he flips a coin. Let's say he says it's right to help old ladies cross the street and it's wrong to stomp babies to death. Well, let's say he decides for whatever reason to flip that coin again. Well, now it turns out it's right to stomp babies to death and wrong to help old ladies cross the street. So now let's say that God opens up the sky and comes down to us and says, all right, you all better start stomping babies. I don't know. It'd be terrifying. Maybe I would start stomping babies to death, but I don't think I would be happy about it. I don't think I would suddenly think, oh, this is definitely the moral thing to do. Why? Because there are reasons beyond mere commands why moral things are moral, right? And furthermore, it wouldn't make sense any longer to refer to God as good, because the word good is interchangeable with bad. It's meaningless. It doesn't matter. Okay, sorry, we're out of time. There's just one more slide that I'll turn to when we come back to this next week before getting into subjectivism and relativism. So sorry to go a little bit over time. I'll try to respect all of your time. But yeah, so today we finished with just one half of the dilemma. And so when we begin next class on Monday, we'll talk about the other horn of the dilemma. And then we'll get into the meta-ethical positions of relativism, subjectivism, and emotivism. Okay, but before we go, are there any questions or comments for me? Any issues? All right, guys, well, thanks. Hang in there. I hope you guys try to have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week. And let me know if you have any suggestions for our last ethical issue we take up. But okay, guys, have a good one.
Yeah.